It was a crisp, breezy Friday night in Brookfield, the kind of night that felt both calm and electric at once. The small suburban town was mostly quiet, but if you headed toward Brookfield Park, you'd catch the sound of laughter and music drifting in the cool air. Here, in a tucked-away corner of the park, 17-year-old Jordan Miller and a few of his friends had gathered around a bench, surrounded by the trees swaying gently overhead. This spot was their favorite hangout, away from prying eyes but close enough to home to walk back if they needed to. The dim streetlight cast an amber glow over their faces as they talked, their voices animated with the excitement and relief that school was finally out. Jordan stood out among his friends. Taller than most of them, he had a quiet confidence in the way he held himself, a look in his eyes that was both youthful and wise beyond his years. His mother, Angela, often told him he had a presence that reminded her of his late father, steady, thoughtful, yet ready to burst with energy when the moment called for it. Tonight that energy was contagious as he laughed and joked with his friends, feeling the weight of his school year lifting, at least for a while. "You think MS. Ramirez is really going to pass you," Marcus Jordan teased, elbowing his friend as they all laughed. Marcus had been struggling all semester, but the group had rallied around him, making sure he studied and stayed out of trouble. It was moments like this that made Jordan realize how important his friends were to him. They were his second family. In their little world, they looked out for each other, shared the highs and lows, and had an unspoken bond that would probably last beyond high school. "Man, if she doesn't, it's going to be because of that quiz I bombed on purpose," Marcus shot back, grinning as he threw a piece of crumpled paper at Jordan. They all laughed, the sound carrying across the park like an echo of freedom and joy. In this moment, they weren't thinking about the responsibilities waiting for them in the real world or the pressures they often faced as young black men in a predominantly white community. Here they were just kids, enjoying the warmth of friendship under a canopy of stars. But that easygoing feeling wouldn't last. Around the corner from the park, a black and white police cruiser made its rounds through the empty streets. Officer Tommy Grant drove in silence, his jaw set in a tense line as he scanned the area. Grant was known around town for his no-nonsense approach, a trait that some saw as dedication and others as intimidation. For years he'd patrolled these streets, but there was a hard edge to his gaze that often made people uneasy, especially those who didn't look like him. Riding alongside him was his new partner, Officer Ethan Walters, fresh out of the academy. Walters was eager and observant, but still unsure about his role and place within the department. As they turned onto the road leading past Brookfield Park, Grant's eyes narrowed when he spotted a group of teenagers gathered near one of the benches. "Look at that," he muttered, more to himself than to Walters. Middle of the night, group of kids just hanging around. What do they think they're doing out here? Walters glanced over, trying to read his partner's expression. Probably just celebrating school being out. It's that time of year. Grant scoffed. "Doesn't matter. This is how trouble starts. A group like that doesn't need to be loitering around in the dark. Come on, let's go see what they're up to." Inside the park, Jordan and his friends were oblivious to the car slowly pulling up near the edge of the trail. They were still caught up in the jokes, the stories, and the excitement of planning their summer. Jordan's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he fished it out, glancing at the message from his mom, Angela. She'd texted, reminding him to be safe and not to stay out too late. He couldn't help but smile a little. His mom was always protective, though he knew she meant well. She had raised him to be careful, especially when it came to encounters with law enforcement. Angela had always been upfront with Jordan about the reality of being black in America, the double standards and the unspoken rules he'd need to live by to stay safe. But tonight, Jordan felt a rare sense of freedom, like maybe he could just let go and have fun without looking over his shoulder. He'd always been responsible, careful to avoid situations that might invite trouble, knowing how quickly things could go sideways. But he couldn't have known that in a few short minutes, everything would change. The sound of footsteps crunching over the gravel broke the easy rhythm of their laughter, and the teens turned to see two officers walking toward them. The group fell silent, the sudden tension settling over them like a shadow. They exchanged quick, nervous glances, each of them instinctively straightening up, as if trying to appear less threatening, more innocent. "Evening, gentlemen," Officer Grant said, his voice low and steady. He stopped a few feet away from the group, his eyes scanning each of their faces. Walters hung back, hands clasped in front of him, watching the interaction unfold. "Good evening," Officer Jordan replied politely, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He could sense that this wasn't just a casual check-in. There was something in the officer's eyes, a hard glint that seemed to see them as suspects, not kids just enjoying their night. Grant looked around at the scattered items on the bench, a few soda cans, a Bluetooth speaker, and some snacks. "Got some kind of party going on here?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Jordan shook his head, keeping his voice calm. "No, sir, just hanging out. School's out and we were just catching up, that's all." Grant's gaze lingered on Jordan, his jaw clenching slightly. "You know, there's a noise complaint in this area. Neighbors say they heard some loud music, people being rowdy. And here we find you and your buddies in the middle of the night. Doesn't look too good." Jordan swallowed, his heart beating a little faster. He knew what was coming. He could feel the familiar sense of dread creeping over him, the same feeling he'd had during countless other encounters where he'd been watched, followed, or questioned for simply existing in a public space. "No problem, officer," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll pack up and head home." But Grant wasn't done. He took a step closer, his hand hovering near his belt. "You got ID on you?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Jordan's. Jordan's friends shifted uncomfortably, the tension mounting as they realized this wasn't going to be a quick encounter. One of them muttered under his breath, a frustrated sigh that didn't go unnoticed by Grant. "What was that?" Grant snapped, his gaze shifting to the boy who'd spoken. "Got something to say?" "No, sir," the boy mumbled, lowering his head. The group exchanged uneasy glances, knowing all too well that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. Jordan took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket to pull out his ID, feeling his pulse race. He handed it to the officer, who examined it with a look of disdain before shoving it back at him. Walters watched quietly from behind, his own face a mixture of discomfort and confusion. He could sense that something was off, but he didn't feel he had the authority to intervene. Grant finally looked at Walters and gave a small nod. "Call it in," he said, the words feeling heavy in the air. The teen's hearts sank as they realized this night was far from over. Jordan clenched his fists, glancing at his friends, trying to stay calm for their sake. But he knew that once the officers made the call, everything would change. As Walters reached for his radio, Jordan's mind raced, trying to recall everything his mother had taught him about staying calm, keeping his hands visible, and never giving them a reason to escalate. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he did, it wouldn't be enough. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around at his friends. The realization hit them all at once. This wasn't going to be a simple, routine interaction. He could see the fear in their eyes, mirroring his own anxiety. His mother had warned him about this, told him how to handle encounters with the police, taught him to be polite, keep his hands visible, avoid sudden movements. He tried to keep his cool, but the tension in the air was suffocating, pressing down on them as if the very ground beneath their feet had turned hostile. Officer Grant watched the group with a hard, assessing gaze, as if he were calculating his next move. After a few moments, he turned his attention back to Jordan, his eyes narrowing. "So, you're just out here hanging around, huh? School's out, so you think it's fine to be out this late, making noise, disturbing the peace?" "We weren't disturbing anyone," Officer Jordan replied, choosing his words carefully. "We didn't mean to be loud or anything. We'll clean up and head home." But Grant's gaze didn't soften. If anything, he seemed to grow more agitated. "You kids think you own this park. Think you can just come here, act however you want, with no respect for the people who live here." He took a step closer, his voice growing colder, more menacing. Jordan fought the urge to take a step back, knowing it would only make things worse. "No, sir, we're just here to relax." "We didn't mean any disrespect," Jordan replied, trying to keep his tone calm. Beside him, Marcus shifted uncomfortably, and Jordan could see his friend's jaw tightening. Marcus was usually the jokester of the group, the one who could find humor in almost anything, but right now he looked tense, his body stiff with apprehension. "Hey, officer, we're just trying to enjoy the night," Marcus said, forcing a smile. "We're not causing any trouble." Grant's eyes flicked over to Marcus, and his expression darkened. "Did I ask for your input?" he snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe you kids need to learn some respect. People around here don't want groups of teenagers loitering around, causing a ruckus. And I don't want to hear any back talk. Got it? Marcus's smile faded, his face growing serious. He muttered a quiet, "Yes, sir," but Jordan could see the frustration in his eyes. They'd had talks like this before, about the unfairness they faced, about the need to keep calm in these moments. But Jordan knew that every encounter chipped away at their patience. It wasn't easy to keep taking it, to keep swallowing their frustration in the name of survival. Officer Walters stood a few feet away, his posture rigid, and Jordan noticed the slight unease in his expression. Walters looked like he wanted to say something, to maybe tell Grant to ease up, but he held back, choosing to keep silent. Jordan felt a flicker of hope, wondering if maybe, just maybe, this younger officer would step in and keep things from escalating. But Walters only watched, his gaze darting between Grant and the teens, his silence speaking volumes. Jordan shifted his stance, trying to ease the tension in his muscles. "Look, officer, we don't want any trouble. We're all just planning to head home. We'll be out of here in a minute." But Grant wasn't finished. "Oh, you'll leave when I say you can leave," he said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "You think you can just tell me what to do?" He stepped even closer, his face inches from Jordan's. "Let me make this clear, you don't call the shots around here. Got that?" "Yes, sir," Jordan replied, forcing himself to hold Grant's gaze, even as every instinct told him to look away. He felt the fear creeping up, mixing with anger and frustration, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was exactly what his mother had prepared him for. Angela had told him, time and again, that there would be moments when people would look at him and see a threat, when his every action would be scrutinized, judged through a lens of suspicion. She'd warned him to stay calm, to never give them a reason to escalate. But standing here, face to face with Grant's simmering anger, Jordan realized just how hard it was to follow that advice. Grant's stare lingered on Jordan's face, as if he were daring him to react, to make one wrong move. After what felt like an eternity, Grant finally looked away, turning his attention to the rest of the group. "Everyone, hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice cutting through the night air. The teens complied, each of them raising their hands, a mix of fear and confusion on their faces. This was something they'd seen in the news, read about, even talked about, but now it was real, and it felt surreal, like they'd stepped into a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Now Grant continued, his gaze scanning the group. "I'm going to need to see IDs from all of you." He held out his hand expectantly, waiting for them to produce their identification. Jordan exchanged a quick glance with Marcus, who looked like he was about to argue, but Jordan shook his head slightly, a silent plea for his friend to keep calm. He reached into his pocket, moving slowly, aware of every movement, and pulled out his wallet, handing his ID to Grant. One by one, his friends did the same, handing over their IDs, their expressions wary. Grant examined each ID, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if he were expecting to find something incriminating. Walters, standing behind him, shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder at the teens, but he still said nothing, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. When Grant finished, he handed the ID ads back with a smirk. "You're all from around here, huh? Probably think that makes you special, makes you untouchable." Jordan felt his face flush with anger, but he kept his voice steady. "No, sir. We just wanted a place to hang out for a bit. We'll be out of here soon, like we said." But Grant wasn't interested in their explanations. He gestured toward their belongings, the soda cans, the snack wrappers, the speaker. "What's all this? Having a party? Drinking, maybe?" "No," Sir Jordan replied firmly. "Just soda. We're not doing anything illegal." Grant scoffed, crossing his arms. "Sure. That's what they all say." He looked over at Walters, nodding slightly. "Search their stuff." Jordan's stomach dropped as he watched Walters step forward, his face a mix of reluctance and obedience. Walters avoided their gaze as he began going through their things, picking up the soda cans, turning them over as if he expected to find something hidden inside. One of Jordan's friends, Chris, shifted uncomfortably. "This is crazy," he muttered under his breath. "We didn't do anything wrong." Grant's head snapped toward Chris, his eyes narrowing. "What was that? You got something to say, kid?" Chris's face went pale and he shook his head quickly. "No, sir, nothing." "That's what I thought," Grant replied, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before hanging around in a place where you don't belong." The words hit Jordan like a punch to the gut. This was his town, his neighborhood, a place he'd lived all his life, and yet here was this officer telling him he didn't belong. It was a sentiment he'd felt before, a subtle message woven into glances, whispers, the way people seemed to hold their purses a little tighter when he walked by. But hearing it spoken out loud with such venom cut deeper than he'd expected. After searching through their things and finding nothing incriminating, Walters finally stepped back, his face flushed. He looked at Grant, waiting for further instructions, as if hoping that this would be the end of it. Grant stared at the group for a long moment, as if weighing his options. "All right," he said finally. "You're free to go. But I'd think twice about hanging around here at night. Next time, you might not be so lucky." Relief washed over Jordan and his friends, but it was mixed with humiliation, a bitterness that lingered even as they began to gather their belongings. Jordan looked back at Grant, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral, refusing to let the officer see how much this encounter had shaken him. As they walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had been taken from him. Something invisible but deeply felt a sense of belonging, of safety. This was his town, his home, but in the eyes of people like Officer Grant, he would always be an outsider, someone who didn't belong. And no matter how hard he tried to play by the rules, to stay calm, to avoid confrontation, he couldn't escape the feeling that he would never be truly free. The night air felt colder as Jordan and his friends walked away from the officers, the silence heavy with frustration and a stinging humiliation none of them wanted to acknowledge. They kept their heads down, clutching their belongings, trying to process what had just happened. Jordan's mind raced, replaying every word, every look, and every movement that had passed between him and Officer Grant. The anger simmered beneath his calm facade, burning hot but restrained, just as his mother had taught him. But even with his calm approach, he could still feel the weight of injustice settling in, heavier and more present than ever. "Man, I'm sick of this," Marcus muttered as they left the park, his voice low but trembling with anger. "They always pull this crap with us, treating us like we're criminals just because we're out late." Jordan gave him a nod, understanding his frustration, but he placed a steadying hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I know, man. But let's just get out of here, okay? No use making it worse." Chris, who had been silent up until now, suddenly stopped, his face set in a look of defiance. "No, Jordan. This is messed up. We didn't do anything wrong. Why should we just keep letting them treat us like this?" "Yeah, Chris is right," another friend added. "It's like they're looking for any excuse to mess with us. It's not fair." Jordan clenched his jaw, feeling his friend's anger pulse through him like a shared heartbeat. They weren't wrong, but he knew that if they turned back or raised their voices, it would only play into the hands of officers like Grant, officers who saw them as trouble by default. He took a deep breath, trying to swallow the bitterness that had taken root inside him. "Look, let's just go. They're just waiting for us to react. They want a reason to escalate things." But as they took their first steps out of the park, the flash of blue and red lights flooded the path in front of them, casting long, menacing shadows. Jordan's heart sank as he realized the officers hadn't actually let them go. They'd simply waited for them to lower their guard, to believe, however briefly, that they'd escaped unscathed. Officer Grant's voice came over the loudspeaker from the patrol car, laced with a warning Jordan couldn't ignore. "Hey, I said you could leave the park. I didn't say you could just walk away." The group froze, exchanging worried glances. Jordan turned around slowly, feeling his stomach twist with a sense of dread. This time there would be no talking their way out of it, no polite words that would placate Grant. He could see the officer stepping out of his car, his face set in a smirk that barely concealed his anger. "What's the problem?" Officer Jordan asked, keeping his voice steady, though he could feel his composure slipping with each passing second. Grant approached them slowly, each step deliberate, as if he were savoring the power he held over them. "The problem, son, is that I don't like your attitude. I told you to leave, and yet here you are, mouthing off as if you own the place." Jordan felt a surge of frustration, but he bit his tongue, forcing himself to stay calm. "We're leaving, officer, just like you said." But Grant wasn't finished. "Not fast enough. And it sounds like some of you don't appreciate the way you're being treated." He looked over at Chris, who stared back defiantly, refusing to back down. Without warning, Grant's expression hardened, and he gestured toward the group with a cold, commanding tone. All of you, up against the fence. Hands behind your heads." Jordan's heart raced as he heard Grant's words, and he could see the panic flash across his friends' faces. This was what they'd feared, what they'd been trying to avoid. Walters, who had remained in the car, got out and looked around nervously, his gaze shifting between the teens and his partner, as if he could sense that the situation was escalating but didn't know how to stop it. "Officer, come on," Jordan said, struggling to keep his voice calm. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're just trying to go home." Grant's eyes narrowed as he took another step closer, his hand hovering dangerously close to his belt. "Are you resisting an officer's order?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "Because that's what it sounds like to me." Jordan took a deep breath, trying to stay grounded, but he could feel his control slipping. He didn't know how much more he could take, how much longer he could stand there and allow himself and his friends to be treated this way. "No, sir," he managed, keeping his tone as steady as he could muster. "We're not resisting. But this isn't fair." Grant's face twisted into a sneer, and he moved toward Jordan with a force that left no room for argument. "You want to talk about fair?" he spat. "I see a group of teenagers out here in the middle of the night, acting like they own the place. I'm here to make sure the people in this town feel safe, and right now you and your friends are not making that easy." Jordan's frustration boiled over, and he couldn't keep the anger from his voice. "We're just walking home. We're not doing anything wrong, and you know it. Why can't you just let us be?" In an instant, Grant's expression turned icy, and before Jordan could react, he felt the officer's hand on his shoulder, gripping him tightly and spinning him around. "That's it. You're under arrest for resisting and disorderly conduct," Grant said, his voice a harsh whisper in Jordan's ear. Jordan's friends watched in horror as Grant forced him against the fence, pulling his hands behind his back with a force that made Jordan wince. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around his wrists, and he felt the bite of the steel digging into his skin. His mind raced, a mix of shock and fear, disbelief at the rapid turn of events. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd done everything his mother had told him to do, everything he could to avoid this outcome, and yet here he was, hands cuffed, his dignity stripped away in an instant. Chris took a step forward, a desperate look in his eyes. "Officer, please, he didn't do anything wrong. We're just trying to go home." Grant shot Chris a glare, his hand still firmly on Jordan's shoulder. "You want to join him? Keep talking. I'd be happy to bring you all in for the night." Chris froze, his face pale, and he took a step back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Jordan could see the helplessness in his friends' faces, the anguish that mirrored his own, and he felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. This was what he'd wanted to protect them from, what he'd tried so hard to avoid, but it hadn't been enough. Walters, still standing off to the side, looked on, his face a mixture of discomfort and guilt. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Grant's sharp glare silenced him. Walters lowered his gaze, his hands clenched at his sides, and Jordan could see the battle raging in the young officer's eyes. But Walters remained silent, his loyalty to his partner outweighing any impulse he might have had to intervene. Jordan felt himself being led toward the patrol car, his friends looking on in stunned silence. He wanted to tell them it was okay, that he'd be fine, but the words caught in his throat. All he could think of was his mother's voice, her warnings, her reminders to stay calm and keep his head down. And for the first time, he felt the weight of those words fully, realizing just how powerless he was in the face of people who saw him as nothing more than a threat. The ride to the station was a blur of flashing lights and quiet resignation. Jordan sat in the back seat, his wrists aching from the tightness of the cuffs, his mind spinning with fear and disbelief. He thought of his mother, how she'd raised him to be careful, to avoid situations just like this one, but he couldn't help but wonder if anything would have changed the outcome. Maybe, he thought, it didn't matter what he said or did. Maybe he was always meant to end up here, treated as a criminal in a world that seemed determined to see him that way. When they arrived at the station, Jordan felt a numbness settle over him, a sense of detachment that made everything seem surreal. He was led inside, his hands still cuffed, his head held high, but inside he felt like he was breaking, like everything he believed about himself, about his safety, was crumbling. He'd been taught to believe in the system, in the idea of justice, but tonight that belief felt like a distant, unreachable dream. As he was led through the cold, sterile hallways of the station, A flicker of hope surfaced in his mind. His mother would come for him, he knew that much. Angela Miller was a fighter, a woman who had spent her life defending the innocent, and she would not rest until he was out of this place. She would come, and when she did, he'd tell her everything, knowing that if there was anyone who could set things right, it was her. But for now, all he could do was wait, the cold metal cuffs a constant reminder of the injustice he could do nothing to escape. Angela Miller was just finishing up some paperwork when her phone buzzed on the corner of her desk. The faint sound pulled her out of her focused state, and she reached for it without thinking. She'd stayed late at the office, catching up on case files for a trial set to begin next week. It wasn't unusual for her to lose track of time like this. As the district attorney for the county, she had learned that late nights and early mornings were part of the deal, but her son Jordan was always at the back of her mind, especially on nights like this. She glanced at her phone and saw it was a text from one of Jordan's friends, Marcus. Her brow furrowed as she opened the message. It read, "MS Miller, something happened. The cops took Jordan. We didn't know who else to call." Angela's heart seemed to stop for a moment as she reread the message, trying to process what she was seeing. She quickly dialed Marcus's number, and he picked up on the second ring. She could hear the worry and fear in his voice before he even spoke a full sentence. "Marcus, where is Jordan? What happened?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice calm. "MS Miller. We were just hanging out at the park," Marcus began, his voice trembling. "And these two officers came up to us, said we were disturbing the peace. We tried to tell them we weren't doing anything, but one of them, he got really angry. And Jordan, he tried to calm things down, but they just wouldn't listen." Angela felt her grip tighten on her phone, her heart racing. She fought to keep her voice steady, but she could feel the fear and anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Where did they take him, Marcus?" "To the station, I think," he replied. We didn't know what to do, MS Miller. I'm so sorry. Jordan didn't do anything wrong. They just took him." Angela's mind raced as she tried to process the situation. She could feel her pulse pounding, each beat a reminder of everything she'd feared, everything she'd tried to protect Jordan from. She thanked Marcus and hung up, grabbing her car keys and heading out of the office with a sense of urgency she hadn't felt in years. As she drove to the police station, memories flooded her mind, moments she'd spent warning Jordan about situations like this, urging him to be careful, to always stay calm, to never give anyone a reason to see him as a threat. She'd taught him everything she knew about navigating a world that often judged him before he even opened his mouth, and yet here he was, detained and humiliated, his freedom stripped away because of someone else's assumptions. Angela knew the police station well. She had worked with the officers there on countless cases, both the honest ones who genuinely wanted to serve their community and the ones who treated power as their personal weapon. But tonight she wasn't the DA walking into a precinct to coordinate a case. Tonight, she was a mother desperate to protect her son. When she arrived, she didn't wait at the front desk. She walked directly through the lobby, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she made her way toward the holding area. She could feel eyes on her, people recognizing her as she moved through the building, but she didn't care about appearances or protocol. She only cared about getting Jordan out. She reached the holding area, and an officer at the desk looked up, startled by her sudden entrance. "Ma'am, can I help you?" he asked, recognizing her and clearly unsure why she was there. "Yes, you can," Angela replied, her tone firm and unyielding. "I'm here to see my son, Jordan Miller. He was brought in tonight. I want to know why he's here and why he hasn't been released." The officer stammered, clearly caught off guard. MS Miller, I'll need to check with." "No, you don't need to check with anyone," Angela interrupted, her voice laced with a controlled anger. "You need to bring him to me. Now." The officer hesitated, looking around as if hoping someone else would take over. Finally, he nodded, picked up the phone, and made a quick call. Moments later, he gestured for her to follow him. Angela's heart raced as she followed the officer down the hallway, the sterile walls and fluorescent lights doing little to ease her growing rage. Every step brought her closer to Jordan, and every step intensified her resolve. She would not let this pass without answers, without accountability. As they reached the door to the holding cell area, she saw Jordan sitting on a bench inside, his head down, his shoulders slumped. The sight of him like that, vulnerable, defeated, stirred a fresh wave of anger in her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let her emotions take over, not yet. Not until she had him safely by her side. The officer opened the door, and Jordan looked up, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and pain as he saw his mother. He stood up, his hands still cuffed in front of him, and Angela felt her breath catch. Seeing her son restrained like a criminal broke something inside her. "Jordan," she said, her voice softer now as she stepped forward. "Are you okay?" Jordan nodded, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the strain of the past hour etched across his face. "I'm fine, Mom," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela turned to the officer standing behind her. "Remove the cuffs." Now she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. The officer looked hesitant, glancing at Jordan and then back at Angela. "Ma, I." Now Angela repeated, her voice cold and unyielding. With a quick nod, the officer stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. As they clattered to the floor, Jordan rubbed his wrists, wincing slightly. Angela watched him, her heart breaking at the sight of the red marks around his wrists, marks that felt like a testament to everything she'd tried to protect him from. Once the cuffs were off, she turned back to the officer. "Who's responsible for this?" she asked, her voice icy with restrained fury. The officer shifted uncomfortably. I believe it was Officer Grant who brought him in, ma'am. He's finishing up the paperwork." "Good," Angela replied, her tone firm. "Because I'm not leaving until I speak to him." The officer nodded and hurried off, clearly eager to distance himself from the situation. Angela placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder, feeling a surge of relief at having him by her side. "Jordan, what happened?" she asked, her voice softening, the motherly concern overriding the DA in her. Jordan took a deep breath, his gaze shifting down as he spoke. "We were just hanging out at the park, Mom. We weren't doing anything wrong." And then this officer. He started accusing us of being loud, disturbing the peace. We tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept pushing, trying to make us look guilty. And then, he told me I was resisting. Angela felt her hands clench at her sides, the anger building again. "Did you say anything to provoke him?" Jordan shook his head. "No, I did everything you told me. I kept calm. I didn't talk back. I did everything right, Mom." Angela closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. She knew her son, knew the kind of young man he was: responsible, thoughtful, careful. He'd always been cautious, especially around authority figures, because he understood the risks in a way no teenager should have to. And yet, here he was, his wrists still bearing the marks of a system that had judged him without cause. "Don't worry, Jordan," she said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "We're going to get to the bottom of this." As she stood there, comforting her son, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Officer Grant walking toward them, his expression shifting when he saw her. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by a look of discomfort. Clearly, he hadn't expected to see her here, and certainly not in this context. "Officer Grant," Angela said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I'd like to know why my son was brought in tonight." Grant hesitated, glancing between Angela and Jordan. "Miss Miller, I didn't realize." "Realize what, officer?" she interrupted, her gaze steady. "That you were detaining the son of the district attorney? Does that change things for you?" Grant's expression faltered, and Angela could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that this was not a situation he could easily control. "Look," he began, his tone defensive. "I was responding to a complaint. The kids were being loud, and when I approached them, they got hostile. Your son was, resisting my instructions." Angela didn't flinch, her gaze piercing. "My son did everything he was supposed to do. He kept calm. He didn't resist. And yet here he is, with marks on his wrists, treated like a criminal for simply existing in a public space." Grant opened his mouth to argue, but Angela cut him off. "You see, officer, I know how this works. I know that young men like my son get seen as threats simply because of who they are. And I can assure you I'm not letting this slide. So I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. because I am taking this matter very seriously." Grant's face went pale, his gaze shifting nervously. Angela held her ground, her unwavering presence a force he couldn't ignore. She knew that tonight was only the beginning of a fight, but she was ready to take it on. Because this wasn't just about Jordan, this was about every young person who'd been treated like they were guilty from the start. Angela's resolve solidified as she locked eyes with Grant, her determination shining through. She would make sure this night didn't end in silence, that the injustice wouldn't be swept away in bureaucratic apathy. And no matter what it took, she would make sure her son knew he was not alone. Angela stood in the fluorescent-lit hallway of the police station, her hand steady on Jordan's shoulder. Beside them, Officer Grant fidgeted, his face pale and uncertain. The weight of Angela's words hung in the air, each one resonating with quiet power. She'd made herself clear she wasn't going to walk away and forget what had happened here tonight. Grant's face, initially confident and unyielding, now betrayed uncertainty. The authority he'd wielded so easily over Jordan and his friends seemed to waver under the gaze of a woman who wasn't just any other parent, she was the district attorney. Angela took a steadying breath, keeping her voice calm but forceful. "I want to speak with the chief," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Grant's discomfort deepened. "Ms. Miller, I'm not sure that's necessary. We can work this out here." "No, Officer Grant, we're done talking here," Angela replied firmly. "My son and his friends were treated with unnecessary aggression and intimidation. They did nothing wrong, and yet they were treated like suspects. I want to understand why." She turned to the officer at the desk nearby, who had been nervously watching the exchange. "Would you please call Chief Harper? I'd like to see him immediately." The desk officer glanced at Grant, who gave a reluctant nod, and then picked up the phone. Angela maintained her calm facade, but beneath it, her frustration and anger simmered. Tonight had tested her in a way she hadn't anticipated, and the protective instincts of a mother had merged with the fierce resolve of a district attorney. This wasn't just about Jordan anymore. This was about confronting a pattern of behavior she'd witnessed countless times but had rarely been on the receiving end of. After a few tense moments, Chief Harper appeared in the doorway, his brows furrowed as he took in the scene. His expression shifted as he recognized Angela, and he approached, his face a careful mask of professionalism. "Angela," he greeted her, extending a hand. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." She ignored the offered handshake, keeping her hands steady at her sides. "Chief, we have a problem. My son was detained tonight under questionable circumstances, and I want to know why." Chief Harper's eyes flickered with understanding, and he shot a wary look at Grant, who had moved a few steps back, attempting to blend into the background. "Let's discuss this in my office," Harper said, gesturing down the hallway. Angela nodded, her gaze never leaving the chief's face. She turned to Jordan, giving him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "I'll be right back," she murmured. Jordan gave a slight nod, though she could see the worry in his eyes. As Angela followed Harper into his office, she could feel the intensity of her emotions sharpening, focusing. She was ready for this. She wasn't going to let Jordan be another story of a young black man mistreated, reduced to a stereotype, or worse, dismissed as if his humanity was conditional. Harper closed the door behind her and motioned for her to sit, but Angela remained standing, her posture unyielding. "Angela," Harper began, his tone cautious. "Let's discuss this calmly. I assure you I'm committed to finding out what happened tonight." "Good," Angela replied, her voice clipped. "Because from where I stand, Chief, it looks like my son was targeted simply for being at a park with his friends. Officer Grant claimed they were disturbing the peace, but from what Jordan and his friends told me, they were doing nothing more than talking and laughing. I want to know why he felt it necessary to escalate the situation to the point of detaining my son." Harper sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Angela, you know as well as I do that sometimes officers respond to complaints from the community. If neighbors reported a disturbance, then—" "This isn't about a noise complaint," Angela interrupted, her voice steady but carrying a hard edge. "This is about an officer treating a group of teenagers as criminals without cause. And if this was merely about a disturbance, why was my son handcuffed? Why was he brought to the station instead of being told to go home?" Harper hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Angela, Officer Grant has been with us for over a decade. He's a bit traditional in his methods, but he's experienced, and he generally knows how to handle these situations. Angela felt her anger flare. Traditional? That's a polite way to excuse what is, in reality, deeply ingrained bias. This is not just about Jordan, Chief. This is about a pattern I have seen time and again. It's about young people of color being treated with suspicion as soon as they're seen in a public space. And I'm telling you now, I won't stand for it. Harper leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but weary. I understand your frustration, Angela. I do. But sometimes officers have to make quick judgments, and those judgments aren't always perfect. Not perfect, Angela's voice rose slightly, the frustration slipping through her otherwise calm demeanor. Chief, my son is 17. He was out with his friends, minding his own business, and he ended up in handcuffs because of an officer's imperfect judgment that's not acceptable. If he had reacted with even a hint of fear or anger, I shudder to think what might have happened. Harper looked away, his expression softening slightly. You're right, Angela, he admitted after a moment. What happened tonight it was wrong. Officer Grant should have handled it differently. I'll make sure he's disciplined for this. Angela shook her head, her gaze fierce. A reprimand isn't enough. Harper, this needs to be addressed at a systemic level. It's not just about punishing one officer for a mistake. It's about changing the culture that allows this kind of treatment to persist. How many other young men have been detained or harassed because of this quick judgment you're defending? Harper's silence told her that he understood the depth of her concern, but she could also see the reluctance in his eyes. She knew he was caught between the loyalty he felt toward his department and the reality of the harm that was being done. But Angela wasn't going to back down. She wouldn't let this go until she saw real change. After a long pause, Harper finally nodded. I hear you, Angela. I'll start an internal review of the policies we're enforcing on these kinds of interactions. And I'll personally see to it that Officer Grant undergoes training on proper de-escalation techniques and bias prevention. Angela's jaw clenched slightly, but she gave a nod, recognizing that this was as much as she could expect for now. That's a start, Chief, but I'll be following up to ensure these changes actually happen. Harper met her gaze, his expression determined. You have my word. Angela's posture softened slightly, the fiery tension in her eyes cooling. I'll hold you to it, she said. She could see the weight of her words settling on him, the understanding that this was a line she was drawing not just as a DA, but as a mother. She left his office, her mind still racing with everything she wanted to say, everything she knew still needed to be done. This was only the beginning. Her heart clenched as she thought about Jordan, the fear she'd seen in his eyes tonight, the vulnerability she'd tried so hard to shield him from. But even in her anger and frustration, she felt a fierce sense of pride. Jordan had stayed calm, had done everything right, and she could see that he carried himself with the dignity she'd always tried to instill in him. When she returned to the waiting area, she saw Jordan sitting on a bench, his eyes fixed on the floor. As she approached, he looked up, relief flooding his face. Angela felt a rush of emotion, the protective love of a mother intertwining with the fierce resolve of a woman who knew that her fight was far from over. Come on, Jordan, she said softly, reaching out a hand to him. He stood, taking her hand, and together they walked out of the station and into the cool night air. She felt his grip tighten slightly as they stepped outside, his presence grounding her in a way that made her feel both powerful and vulnerable all at once. As they reached her car, Angela looked over at her son, her voice gentle but resolute. This isn't over, Jordan. Not by a long shot. What happened tonight shouldn't have happened, not to you, not to anyone. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Jordan nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He knew his mother, knew her strength, her tenacity. And though he'd faced a darkness tonight that he hadn't been prepared for, he felt a strange sense of peace as he looked at her, knowing she would fight for him, for his friends, for all of them. As they drove home, the streetlights cast soft, fleeting shadows across the car, illuminating their faces in brief, gentle bursts. Angela's mind was filled with plans, strategies, a growing resolve to push forward with the fight for justice. She'd been a force in the courtroom for years, but tonight she'd been reminded of why she'd chosen this path, of who she was fighting for. And as they pulled into the driveway, she looked over at Jordan, a quiet determination in her eyes. We're in this together, Jordan. You're not alone. Jordan gave a small nod, his expression a mixture of gratitude and resolve. He knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Angela woke with a clarity that cut through her usual early morning haze. After a night of restless sleep, she'd arrived at one conclusion: what happened to Jordan was a culmination of everything she'd fought against in her career, but it was also a reminder of just how much work there was left to do. The echo of her son's voice, his recounting of the fear he'd felt and the unfairness of it all, stirred something fierce inside her. She would not let her son and others like him suffer silently. Today she would take a stand. Angela's first stop was her office. She'd been with the district attorney's office for nearly 2 decades, each case a battle, each victory a step forward in her journey to bring justice to those who too often found themselves outside its reach. As she entered the building, her colleagues greeted her warmly, some noticing the tight line of her jaw, the focus in her eyes. There was no small talk this morning. Today, Angela was on a mission, and nothing would deter her. She spent the early part of the morning reviewing files, pulling together statistics and case records, piecing together the story she knew she would need to tell. As she read through familiar case after familiar case, she felt a heavy sense of déjà vu. So many names, so many young black men and women who had been detained, questioned, even mistreated under the guise of maintaining order, and each story, each record, was a testament to the biases that had become so deeply ingrained in the system she worked within. Angela was brought back to her own childhood in a town not unlike Brookfield. Growing up, she'd witnessed her own family struggle under the weight of assumptions and stereotypes, her father being questioned countless times for simply driving an unfamiliar car or walking in a neighborhood where he was out of place. Her mother, a community organizer, had been Angela's first teacher in the art of standing up for what was right. Angela remembered her mother rallying neighbors, challenging local officials, and speaking out at city council meetings with a voice that was clear, confident, and unapologetically strong. Her mother had taught Angela that silence was complicity, that if you had the strength to speak up, then you had an obligation to do so, not just for yourself, but for everyone who didn't have the same platform, the same chance. That lesson had carried Angela through her schooling, through law school, and into her work as a DA, where she'd committed herself to being an advocate for those who were overlooked, mistreated, or simply cast aside. And yet, despite all her years of work, here she was facing the same struggle within her own family. Her own son had been treated with suspicion and contempt simply for existing in a public space with his friends. The realization left a bitter taste in her mouth, a sense of helplessness that felt both foreign and infuriating. By midday, Angela had collected enough material to build her case not for a trial, but for something larger, something that she hoped would bring real change. She called her assistant, Brenda, into her office, laying out her plan. "Brenda, I'm going to hold a press conference this afternoon," she said, her voice calm but resolute. Brenda's eyes widened slightly. A press conference? About what happened to Jordan? Angela nodded. Yes, but not just about Jordan. This is about the bigger picture. We need to address what happened, yes, but we also need to address why it happened. People need to understand that this isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a systemic issue that needs to be addressed from the ground up. Brenda nodded slowly, her expression serious. I'll get everything set up then. Do you want a formal statement prepared? Angela shook her head. I know exactly what I want to say. I don't need a script for this one. A few hours later, the small press room adjacent to her office was filled with reporters, their cameras and microphones trained on Angela as she stepped up to the podium. Her heart pounded not with fear but with the adrenaline of purpose, the conviction that had driven her here and would see her through. She looked out at the crowd, feeling the weight of their attention, knowing that what she said here would echo far beyond this room. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here on such short notice, she began, her voice steady. I'm here today not just as the district attorney of this county, but as a mother, as a citizen, and as a member of a community that deserves better. Last night, my son was detained by law enforcement officers under circumstances that, quite frankly, reflect a troubling pattern of racial bias and unjust treatment. My son and his friends were simply spending time at a park, laughing, talking, and enjoying the end of their school year. And yet, because of the assumptions made by a few officers, they were treated as suspects, not citizens. Angela took a breath, letting her words settle over the room. She could feel the energy of the crowd shifting, their interest intensifying as they sensed the importance of what she was saying. This incident is not just about my son, she continued. It is about a deeply ingrained issue within our system, an issue that affects countless young people who, like my son, have done nothing wrong, yet find themselves subject to suspicion and harassment simply because of the color of their skin. We cannot continue to accept this. We cannot continue to let our young people be seen as threats instead of the valuable members of our community that they are. A murmur ran through the room, and Angela could see several reporters nodding, their faces reflecting the impact of her words. She pressed on, the passion in her voice growing. As district attorney, I am calling for a formal investigation into the practices and biases within our law enforcement agencies. I am calling for mandatory training on de-escalation and bias prevention for all officers. And I am calling for a renewed commitment from every member of our justice system to uphold the values of fairness, respect, and accountability. This is not just a demand, it is a promise. A promise to the families in this community, to the young people who deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhoods, and to everyone who believes that justice should be applied equally, without prejudice. Angela paused, allowing the gravity of her statement to sink in. She could feel the weight of the room's attention, the shift in energy as her words resonated. She knew that what she was proposing would not be easy, that it would face resistance, but she also knew that she couldn't remain silent. Not after what had happened to Jordan, and not after all the years she'd spent fighting for justice. As a mother, I want to know that my son can walk in a park without being seen as a threat, she said, her voice softer but no less powerful. And as district attorney, I will not rest until that vision is a reality for my son, for his friends, and for every young person in our community. We cannot let this moment pass without action. We owe it to our community, to our future, to make sure that no young person has to experience what my son went through last night. Angela stepped back from the podium, a silence settling over the room as her words echoed in the minds of those present. The reporters looked at her with a newfound respect, understanding that this was more than just a press conference, it was a call to action, a declaration of intent that would reverberate far beyond the walls of this room. As she left the podium, Brenda met her with a look of admiration and pride. "That was powerful," Brenda said, her voice filled with emotion. "I think you may have just started something, Angela." Angela nodded, feeling the weight of what she'd set in motion. "It's about time, don't you think?" Brenda smiled, and Angela felt a wave of relief, mingled with determination. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, that there would be pushback from those who preferred the status quo. But she also knew that there was no turning back. She would fight, not just for Jordan, but for every child, every young person who deserved to be seen as more than just a threat. That evening, as she sat with Jordan at home, watching him laugh and relax after the tension of the previous night, Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always been dedicated to her work, but now, that dedication had taken on a personal, urgent weight. This was her fight, her legacy, a fight for justice that went beyond courtrooms and legal arguments. It was a fight for her family, for her community, and for a future where young people like Jordan would never have to doubt their worth or safety in the places they called home. The days following Angela's press conference brought a flurry of activity. Her words had rippled across the community, sparking conversations, igniting debates, and inspiring support from unexpected places. Messages poured into her office, emails, letters, even handwritten notes, some thanking her for standing up, others offering stories of similar experiences, tales of young lives treated with suspicion, dignity stripped in the name of public safety. Angela's phone buzzed constantly with media requests, community organizers asking for her partnership, and parents who, like her, had lost sleep worrying about their children's safety in a system that too often failed them. Yet with all the support came opposition as well. Some voices in the media and even among city officials dismissed her statements, downplaying her concerns as overreactions or emotional responses. A few went as far as to accuse her of anti-police rhetoric, twisting her words to serve narratives that ignored the heart of the issue she'd raised. Angela had expected this. She knew that pushing for change would make waves, that people who were comfortable with the way things were would resist any attempt to disrupt their reality. But she was undeterred. The backlash only strengthened her resolve. At home, the atmosphere had shifted. Angela and Jordan spoke openly about what had happened, dissecting every moment of that night and reflecting on the weight it carried. Jordan had been quieter since the incident, but there was a new spark in his eyes, a subtle determination that hadn't been there before. Angela recognized it as a seed of purpose, one she hoped would grow into a commitment to standing up for others, just as she had. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Jordan looked up at her, his face serious. "Mom," he began, his voice calm but reflective. "Have you always felt like this? Like there's this layer over everything that you just can't shake? Like you're constantly being watched?" Angela set down her fork, meeting his gaze. She'd spent years trying to shield Jordan from these realities, hoping that if he was careful, if he followed the rules, he could avoid the shadows of suspicion that followed so many people of color. But the truth was, she'd always known that one day he would understand that feeling all too well. "Yes," she replied quietly, her voice steady but heavy with truth. "I've felt it my entire life, and I hoped you'd never have to feel it. But it's there, Jordan. It's real." Jordan nodded, his eyes clouded with a mixture of understanding and sadness. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently that night, if maybe I'd just stayed silent, or if I'd walked away sooner." Angela reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "No, Jordan, you did everything right. This isn't your fault, and there's nothing you could have done differently to change what happened. It was never about you as a person, it was about their assumptions, their biases. You were seen as a threat before you even said a word, simply because you existed in a space they didn't think you belonged." Jordan swallowed, his face tightening with emotion. I never thought I'd feel this way. Like no matter what I do, it's not enough. That I'm somehow already guilty in someone's eyes." Angela's heart ached as she looked at her son, her brilliant, kind-hearted child who was now forced to confront a reality he should never have had to know. "I know, sweetheart," she said softly. "And it's not fair. But I promise you this, I'll do everything in my power to fight for a world where you, and others like you, don't have to carry that burden." As the days went by, Angela's fight became more public. She met with local activists, listened to their stories, and even joined a coalition of community leaders who were pushing for reforms within the police department. These weren't new issues, she knew that. But the momentum had shifted, and she was determined to use her position to create meaningful change. One afternoon, she received a call from Chief Harper. She hadn't spoken to him since the night she'd confronted him at the station, but she knew he'd been following the developments closely. "Angela," he began, his tone respectful but guarded, "I wanted to speak with you about the changes you've been proposing. I think there's room for us to work together on this." Angela felt a flicker of surprise. She'd expected resistance, maybe even stonewalling, but Harper's willingness to engage was a hopeful sign. "Thank you, Chief," she replied, keeping her tone professional. "I'm glad you're open to it. I think we can make real progress if we're willing to take a hard look at what needs to change." They arranged a meeting for the following week, a chance to sit down and discuss actionable steps. Angela knew this was only a start, that real change would take time and persistence, but she was ready to commit to the journey, no matter how long it took. Meanwhile, word of her efforts began to spread through the community. Parents reached out, expressing their support and solidarity, sharing their fears for their own children. Jordan's friends, once reluctant to speak up, found themselves inspired by Angela's stance. At school, Jordan noticed that classmates who had previously stayed silent on such issues were now engaging in conversations, their curiosity piqued by the headlines and the discussions they'd overheard at home. Angela had known this was going to be a tough fight, but what she hadn't anticipated was the impact her actions would have on others. Her press conference had been a turning point, a spark that had ignited a collective desire for justice. And it was Jordan who, one night as they sat together, reminded her of the importance of what they were doing. "Mom," he said, his voice thoughtful, "you remember when you told me about Grandma? How she fought for change, even when no one believed things could get better." Angela smiled, a wave of warmth spreading through her. "Of course. Your grandmother was the bravest person I've ever known. She taught me that change doesn't happen by waiting for the world to catch up. You have to be willing to fight for it, even if you're the only one." Jordan nodded, his face serious. "Well, that's what you're doing now, Mom. You're being that person. And maybe I can be that person too." Angela's heart swelled with pride as she looked at him, seeing in his eyes the determination and strength that had defined her own journey. "You can be anything you want to be, Jordan," she replied, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "And I'll be here, every step of the way, supporting you." As the weeks passed, Angela continued her work, meeting with city council members, organizing town hall meetings, and speaking at community events. She knew that each conversation, each difficult discussion, was a step forward. There were moments of discouragement, times when the resistance felt overwhelming, but she reminded herself of why she'd started this journey and who she was doing it for. One evening, as she and Jordan returned from a community rally, they found a handwritten note tucked into their mailbox. It was from one of Jordan's teachers, a woman Angela barely knew, but whose words moved her deeply. "Thank you, Ms. Miller," the note read. "You've given me hope. You've given all of us hope. Please know that your courage is inspiring more people than you'll ever know." Angela felt a surge of emotion as she read the note, the simple words a reminder of the impact that one voice could have. She turned to Jordan, showing him the note, and they shared a quiet moment of understanding, a recognition of the journey they'd embarked on together. That night, as Angela lay in bed, she thought of her mother, of the strength and resilience she'd shown in the face of countless struggles. She thought of Jordan, his courage and maturity beyond his years, his willingness to stand beside her in this fight. And she thought of all the families, all the young people in her community who deserved a future free from fear, a future where they could live their lives without the weight of unjust assumptions. In that moment, Angela knew that her fight wasn't just about justice or reform. It was about creating a world where her son and every young person could walk with their heads held high, without the shadow of prejudice darkening their path. And she vowed, as she drifted to sleep, that she would not rest until that vision became a reality. Months passed, and though the initial fervor around Angela's press conference had faded, the work she'd started was just beginning. What had started as a single mother's outcry for her son had sparked a movement, one that Angela, with the help of community leaders and allies, nurtured into a lasting campaign for reform. Meetings with the police department had led to concrete changes, beginning with mandatory bias training and de-escalation workshops for officers, and a commitment from Chief Harper to establish a community oversight committee. Angela had never expected to become a face of change. She'd always thought her work as district attorney would be her primary contribution, a way to bring justice within the boundaries of the legal system. But now, as she stood before a small gathering at a community rally in the town square, she realized that her voice had taken on a new role, a bridge between those who felt ignored by the system and those who held the power to change it. The rally was held at sunset, the golden light casting a warm glow over the crowd. Angela glanced at the people around her, a diverse group of families, students, activists, and allies who had come together to show their support. She felt a surge of pride, knowing that each person here represented a commitment to a better future. Jordan stood beside her, holding a sign that read "Justice for All" in bold, hand-painted letters. Over the months, Angela had watched her son grow in ways she hadn't anticipated. The experience had left its mark on him, but rather than retreating into bitterness, Jordan had channeled his feelings into a new passion for justice. He'd become a vocal advocate at his school, leading discussions and even organizing events to educate his peers on issues of bias and equality. As Angela took the stage, the crowd fell silent, their faces turned toward her with a quiet expectancy. She cleared her throat, taking a moment to gather her thoughts before she began. "When I stood before many of you months ago, I was a mother fighting for her son. Today I stand before you not just as a mother, not just as a district attorney, but as a member of this community, a community that has shown me the power of unity, the strength in solidarity. This journey began with my son Jordan, who was treated unjustly by those who were meant to protect him, but it has grown into something much larger than any of us could have imagined." Angela paused, letting her gaze travel across the crowd, taking in the young faces, the parents holding their children, the older citizens who had seen these struggles before. Each face reminded her of why she'd taken on this fight. "We are here today," she continued, her voice strong, "because we believe in a future where justice isn't reserved for a select few, where every young person can walk through their neighborhood without fear, where dignity and respect are afforded to all, regardless of background, race, or status. We are here because we know change isn't something we wait for, it's something we create together." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd, and Angela took a steadying breath, feeling the energy lift her. She could feel the presence of her mother in her words, the legacy of her strength and determination guiding her as she spoke. "None of this would have been possible without each of you," she said, her voice softening. Each person here, each voice raised in support, has been a beacon of hope. Together we have shown that our community will not tolerate injustice, that we will hold accountable those who abuse their power, and that we will fight for a world where every person's humanity is respected. Change is not easy, and the road ahead will be long, but tonight I am hopeful. I am hopeful because of all of you. Angela looked over at Jordan, who gave her an encouraging nod. His eyes held a maturity beyond his years, a testament to the journey he'd been on since that night. She was proud of him, proud of the resilience and strength he'd shown. And she knew that, in many ways, he was the true embodiment of the future she was fighting for. The crowd's applause grew louder, and Angela stepped down, joining Jordan and several others in the front row. One by one, community members took the stage to share their stories, some of pain, some of resilience, some of resilience, some of hope. Parents spoke about their fears for their children, young people shared their experiences with discrimination, and leaders outlined the work that lay ahead. The air buzzed with a sense of purpose, a collective will to keep moving forward. As the evening deepened, Angela and Jordan lingered, listening to each speaker, taking in each story. For Angela, this wasn't just an event, it was a milestone, a sign that the work they'd begun was taking root in the hearts and minds of the community. When the rally began to wind down, Angela felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Chief Harper standing there, his expression somber but respectful. He extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Angela shook it. "I want you to know," he said, his voice quiet, "that I'm committed to seeing this through. We've already started making changes, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure they last." Angela met his gaze, sensing the sincerity in his words. She knew that, like her, Harper had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths, to reckon with the flaws in the system he'd spent his career upholding. But she also knew that change required allies from within. "I appreciate that, Chief," she replied, her tone measured but firm. "This isn't an easy journey, but it's a necessary one. And I'm glad to see you here, standing with us." Harper nodded, a look of resolve settling over his face. "We all have a lot to learn, but I'm ready to do the work." With a final nod, he turned and left, blending into the dispersing crowd. Angela watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of optimism. There was still so much to be done, but the first steps had been taken, and that was enough for now. As the crowd thinned, Angela and Jordan walked back to their car, the quiet hum of the city around them. The night air was cool, carrying with it a sense of peace that felt new, refreshing. Angela glanced over at Jordan, who was gazing out over the town square, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Mom," he said, breaking the silence, "I used to think that nothing would ever change, that no matter what we did, people would always see us a certain way." Angela nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. "I know, and for a long time I worried that too, but we're proving that change is possible, one step at a time." Jordan looked at her, his face softened by a quiet smile. "I'm glad you didn't give up. I'm glad you kept fighting." Angela smiled back, her heart swelling with pride. "I kept fighting because of you, Jordan. Because you and every young person like you deserve a world where you're free to be yourself without fear." They walked the last few steps in silence, a comfortable, shared quiet that felt like the final chapter of a long, hard journey. Angela knew there would be other battles, other moments when the weight of the world would press down on her. But tonight she felt lighter, carried by the knowledge that they had started something meaningful, something lasting. As they drove home, Angela glanced at Jordan, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. She thought of her mother, her own journey, and all the moments that had led her here. She felt a quiet certainty that the path they'd set in motion would continue, that their community would rally around this cause, and that future generations would carry on the fight for justice. That night, as she lay in bed, Angela closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. She knew that change wouldn't come overnight, that there would be setbacks and struggles along the way. But she also knew that they were no longer alone. They had a community behind them, a shared purpose that would sustain them. In the quiet darkness, Angela allowed herself to imagine a future where Jordan, and all the young people like him, could walk freely, without fear or suspicion. It was a vision she held close to her heart, a beacon guiding her forward. And as she drifted into sleep, Angela knew that no matter the obstacles, no matter the cost, she would keep fighting until that future became a reality.